Time to elevate.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to Running on Empty. I am Matt.
And I'm Tony.
And we are running on empty and really excited about our show today, Tony.
Yes, we are joined by Mike McCabe. And Mike is one of Wisconsin's democracy heroes. And we'll talk about what that means. Mike actually grew up in Clark County, Wisconsin, a place where the cows outnumber people. And which is literally true, as he'll tell us, and where the people vote for Republicans, even though the Republicans don't do much for them. And Mike is going to give us some insights into why that happens. Mike is the executive director of Our Wisconsin Revolution, a pro-democracy, social justice organization. If you go to ourwisconsinrev.com and go to the news link, you can listen to some radio commentaries by Mike. They're always very well done and persuasive. I got to know Mike McCabe in the 2000s when he was executive director of the Wisconsin Democracy Campaign, an organization that follows the money and exposes the legalized bribery in our political system. In 2018, a grassroots citizens drive persuaded Mike to enter the Democratic Party primary for governor of Wisconsin. He traveled over 100,000 miles across the state and ran a really inspiring campaign. Full disclosure, I voted for him. He is the author of 2 books published by the independent Little Creek Press. The 2014 book was called Blue Jeans in High Places, The Coming Makeover of American Politics. And his book, released in February of 2020, is called Unscrewing America, Hints and Hopes from the Heartland. And here's a quote from that book that I think really summarizes what Mike is all about. He says, "When the curtain is pulled back, some fundamental truths become clear. Clean air and water don't come from dirty politics.
Nice.
Good health care isn't the natural offspring of a sick political system. And living wages are hard to come by in a dying democracy." I love that quote, Mike. And thank you so much for being with us today. We appreciate it.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Good to be with you.
Yeah, and why don't we start with when you were a very, very young person, you were growing up in Clark County, Wisconsin, which I mentioned, rural county. How is it that the Democrats completely lost any kind of effectiveness in counties like that? What's going on?
Well, yeah, Clark County, for those who don't know the area, it's about halfway between Eau Claire and Wausau in central Wisconsin. The number of cows do outnumber the human population there. Last I counted, there's something like 35,000 people living in Clark County, and there's well over 60,000 cows.
Wow.
So, it's big dairy country. When I was growing up, the area was solidly represented by Democrats. The member of Congress was a Democrat. The local state senator and state assembly representative were Democrats. So, it was an area that I grew up knowing as an area represented by Democrats. Now it's one of the reddest counties in all of America. It
went for Trump both times, right?
It went for Trump in both elections by huge margins. It wasn't close. It went overwhelmingly to Trump. It is represented across the board now by Republicans. So I've watched this.
How do you explain that?
Yeah, I think part of it is that, people like my folks, my dad was born in 1919, my mom in 1921. They're children of the Great Depression. They were made into lifelong Democratic voters by Franklin Roosevelt and the New Dealers. They were old enough to actually remember rural electrification. They remember power lines being strung down back roads. And I grew up on a road that to this day is gravel.
Wow.
It's not a paved road to this day. But down all those back roads, power lines were strung to every farmhouse and every barn. And that made a huge impact on people like my folks. They saw government being put to work in a way that revolutionized rural life and revolutionized the rural economy, and brought something precious to their neck of the woods, namely electricity. And when you think about the modern day equivalent of rural electrification, it would have to be rural broadband. It would have to be bringing high-speed internet to every doorstep, and that's not happening.
No.
Neither party has done that. High-speed internet has not been brought to every doorstep in places like Clark County, and so people are cut off from this tool that is so central to American life now, and that connects you to the modern global economy, and that's not lost on people there. And it's just one example of countless ones I could give, but they see the party of government not doing anything to help their communities. And they really do see the Democrats as the party of government, and they see the Republican Party as the anti-government party. And they don't see the party of government using government to bring about that kind of transformational change anymore. And so they figure if the best they can do is accept the Republicans' offer to try to keep government as small as possible and their taxes as low as possible, that's the offer they'll accept. And and I think my parents have both passed away. We lost them quite a few years ago. You look at the younger generations that are now living in Clark County, they don't have any recollection of the New Deal. They don't have any recollection of Roosevelt's policies. They have no recollection of rural electrification. They've always had electricity. Mm-hmm. All they know is they can't get an internet connection reliably, and they can't get a mobile phone a cell phone signal to save their lives. And they resent that. And and that, I think, as a result, they've turned to the anti-government party.
Exactly. So Mike, we're taping on December 21st, and the U.S. Congress is on the verge of passing a so-called stimulus deal, right? Which I guess is going to give, a $600 payout to most Americans. It'll expand unemployment benefits. How will people in the rural areas respond to something like this?
Well, I think most people will appreciate it for what it is, but it's a paltry gesture, and it doesn't get at the deeper, more fundamental problems that they face. I grew up outside a little town named Curtis, which was far too small to have a school. So I was bused into Owen to go to school. You go to Owen, and there used to be a movie theater on Main Street. It's closed. There used to be a car dealership in town. It's closed. There used to be a grocery store in town. It's closed. You can't even buy groceries in Owen anymore, much less Curtis. And there was a bowling alley. It's closed. Think about that. All those places used to employ people. There were mechanics and car dealers working at the car dealership. There were custodians and ticket takers at the movie theater. All those places employed people, and that employment dried up. And so everybody looked at their little town and said, there's no opportunity here for me, and they left. And I was one of those young people who left. And when the young people left, they never came back because there was nothing to come back to. And when you really think about it, there used to be hundreds of family farms surrounding little towns like that.
Sure.
And now there are a handful of gigantic agricultural factories, massive factory farms that have taken over for all those many farms. Well, a few factories like that run by out-of-state interests. They don't have enough kids to send to school to keep a school system viable. They don't go to movies in town to keep that movie theater going. They don't buy enough cars to keep the car dealership alive. So Democrats, I don't think for a long time have grasped how their reluctance or refusal to continue to enforce antitrust laws in this country have devastated rural communities. It's been decades. since antitrust laws were taken seriously or were enforced. Democrats gave up on them decades ago. But antitrust is a huge rural issue because these huge agricultural factories have driven all these family-run businesses out of business.
Yeah.
And that's ended up bleeding dry those small communities. And so now the enrollment in that school system is half of what it was when I went through the schools in that area. They're having a hard time even keeping the doors open. And soon enough, they'll close and they'll send their kids another 45 minutes or an hour on the bus to go to school somewhere else. Well, what young family is going to want to move into a town like that when there's no school for their kid to go to?
Right.
See, Mike, everything that you're talking about, right, I think the three of us agree should be near the top of the Democratic Party platform. Now, when you ran in 2018, my perception was that the Democratic Party establishment wanted nothing to do with you.
That's
in
fair.
fact, in fact, they were actively opposed. I remember there was a part in your campaign, you talk about this in the book, where you were simply trying to get the voter list, and they tried to prevent you from getting the voter list, right? All this like petty nonsense. You were coming up very high in some of these online polls, and then they would refuse to release the results of the poll.
Yep.
Right? Because Mike comes in first. What the hell is going on? Why would the Democrat establishment be opposed to platform positions and messages that would make them competitive in the entire state? What's going on there?
I think part of the problem, Tony, is that modern day Democrats don't understand rural life.
Yeah.
And if you don't understand rural life, how do you really address the problems that rural communities face? You don't even know what to address. And one of the things that comes with having grown up in a place like where I grew up is I get all these people who hear that I grew up on a farm, and so they'll say, okay, explain to me why these rural people are voting against their own interests. As if they're stupid and they don't even understand their own interests. And I stop them right there and I say, wait a second, the way you define their interests isn't the way they define their interests, and you don't get to decide how they define their interests. You need to listen to them and get an appreciation for what rural life is like today, and understand how they see their interests, because they don't define their interests the same way as you define their interests. And you don't get to impose your definition on them. And I think Democrats, one of the things you'll hear from rural Democrats, the few who are remaining, is that all the messages that come from the state or national parties are boilerplate. They're all the same messages that they deliver in the cities. They don't know how to speak the language of small town or rural Americans, and because they don't understand rural life, and that's a fundamental problem. The Democrats who represented the area back when I was young, they were people who were rooted, they were anchored in those small towns. They understood how those rural communities worked, and that's missing today by the Democrats.
Matt, let me get one more, and then we'll move it on over to you.
Sure.
One thing that I've always found really impressive in your work, Mike, and I've heard you talk about this a number of times, is you think that part of the problem is that we tend to think of politics as left versus right, but you believe a more productive and a more accurate formulation is to look at politics top down. And I think this is the key to unifying rural and urban. Can you explain to us what you mean by looking at politics top down instead of left right?
Well, we've been trained to think about politics horizontally, from left to right.
Yes.
We put people on that horizontal spectrum. You know, one person's a liberal, so they're on the left. Another person's a conservative, so they're on the right. We put people in the middle. There really isn't a center in today's politics. It's gone. People are polarized, and so they've been trained to think of each other as very divided and very far apart, when in reality, if you just flipped that horizontal spectrum on its head and start thinking vertically instead, and think about who's on top and who's on the bottom. And I'm not just talking about money here. Economics is part of it. Who's got the most money? Who's got the least? Who's got the most economic power? who's most vulnerable economically. That's part of what I'm talking about. But I'm also talking about whose voices are heard and whose are ignored, who has political clout and who doesn't. Most Americans are at or near the bottom of that vertical spectrum.
Yes.
Liberals and conservatives alike, urban people and rural people alike are at or near the bottom of that. And then you've got kind of the American royalty, the wealthy and well-connected few at the top who are fashioning policies that benefit them economically, that put more and more wealth in their bank accounts. And they ignore the needs of working class people, whether they're living in small towns or big cities, whether they vote Democratic or Republican. They're really being ignored, and those are the commoners of our society. And so we really do have a caste system that has emerged in American society. We've got an American royalty that economically and politically is extremely privileged. We've got kind of the courtier class that caters to the royals. Then we've got your commoners, and we've even got the untouchables, the sort of the dispossessed. And when you think about caste systems, we always think that that's a country like India that has had a caste system, and we think of the untouchables and the common classes and then the more aristocratic classes. We've got that right here in America. And if you think about politics in that vertical way, all of a sudden, a Republican voting farmer or a small town resident is actually in the same spot on the spectrum as somebody from the big city who's voting for Democrats regularly. They've got an awful lot in common, and they are getting the shaft politically and economically in our society. And yet they've been trained to see each other as enemies, and they've been constantly put at each other's throats. And they're being turned against each other. If they could see the common ground that they actually stand on, they could make a mighty political force out of that. But
I agree with you, Mike. This is the chief insight of the Occupy Wall Street movement. We are the 99%.
Yep.
Yeah.
99% of us are really in the same place in the society.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea that we have not one major political party that can find a way to respond to or identify with that simple little insight, that is just so pathetic.
Yeah.
Right. Instead, they're both representing the 1%.
And the experience I had in the governor's race was on a much more humble and modest level. The same experience that Bernie Sanders had on a national stage, where the national party went to great lengths to disadvantage him and to sort of make sure that he couldn't get the Democratic nomination. And on a far lower level, I went through that same experience. And so I think that speaks to the need for the citizenry to search for ways to revolutionize our politics, because we don't have the kind of politics currently that is needed to solve the big problems that we face in our society.
Right.
The kind of politics that we really need doesn't exist, so it has to be created.
Right. Go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, I like how you said, we've been, thinking about politics as being horizontal, but if you take that vertical and now you turn that into a list, like let's actually list all the different issues that are out there. And there's such a divide right now. I think if people could actually see this list, that we agree on a whole lot more than, and I think we're going to get into the media with this, but I think we agree on a whole lot more than the media is making it out that we agree upon. You agree with that?
Absolutely. You look at, and I'm always wary of public opinion polling. I think you have to take it with a certain grain of salt, but the major polling findings do square with what you find when you just go out and talk to people and just have those street corner conversations or those coffee shop conversations. When people are asked about something like Medicare for all, it has widespread support, not only among Democratic voters, but Republican voters and independent. You talk about living wages, even boosting the minimum wage all the way up to $15 an hour. As Florida was voting to reelect Donald Trump, and as they were voting out a bunch of Democratic members of Congress, the voters of Florida were also passing a ballot initiative raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour there.
Yes.
Yeah.
So they were voting Republican, and Florida is a state that's increasingly trending red. And yet they were saying, yes, we should have, when you work, you shouldn't be poor. When you work, you shouldn't live below the poverty line. When you work, you actually should be able to make ends meet.
Yeah.
Our minimum wage. And people have broad agreement on things like a need for a national health care program that makes sense, so it's not tied to your employment, especially in this gig economy where people have to bounce from one gig to the next to the next. Holy cow, not having health insurance that stays with you regardless of whether you need to change jobs or not is crippling. And people across the political spectrum recognize that. And so there is this broad agreement. And yet, when you go up to Capitol Hill or even to our state capitol, they're not talking about those areas of common agreement. And they're not acting on those major emergencies facing our society.
Well, they don't have the same reference point. I mean, I'm part of the gig economy, and I can tell you that this has been absolutely crippling. They seriously just don't see it how we see it. And I don't know if there's a way to change that. I mean, we could talk to her blue in the face, we could protest, we could make signs, but what do you think is really needed to start to make the difference and move that needle a little bit more to get folks to understand? Because they seriously don't. Everybody loves their entertainment, but now we have not been working since March 14th. I can tell you, like dominoes, all the shows fell. So how do we fix that? I have no idea.
Well, and obviously the pandemic made many of our national emergencies worse.
Yep.
It made health insecurity worse. We already had a massive problem with health insecurity in this country. We had tens of millions of Americans who didn't have health insurance. We had tens of millions more who had basically useless insurance with deductibles and copays so high that they had to pay for all their medical care out of pocket all year long anyway. And the insurance never kicked in. That was pre-pandemic. Now the pandemic throws millions of Americans out of work, and then they lose the health insurance that's tied to that employment, making that problem worse. Economic inequality has been worsened big time by the pandemic. Billionaires have become $1 trillion richer.
Yeah.
And then a lot of people have lost work and been thrown out of work, and they can't make rent, they can't pay mortgages. Yeah. So the pandemic is a factor that's worsening a lot of these major problems, but the pandemic will pass.
Yeah.
Eventually the pandemic will pass, but there's no vaccine for economic inequality. There's no vaccine for health insecurity or environmental insanity or social and racial injustice. Those are problems that will endure. And one of my frustrations is that trying to get people to pay attention to those kinds of national emergencies is really challenging right now, especially when we're in the midst of a pandemic. But those problems were with us before the pandemic hit. They're going to be with us after the pandemic eventually passes, and they will bring down this country. They will diminish America significantly if we don't muster the political will to deal with them.
Yeah, I think
not dealing with.
Go ahead.
We're not dealing with those problems. We've got our heads firmly stuck in the sand, at least when you look at the political class.
Yeah, I think that if the pandemic did anything, it showed the 99% that your health insurance or your health care should not be tied to your job.
A really dumb idea to tie health care to employment.
Yeah, I mean, I've been self-employed for 25 years, so I've got, we have our own policy that we've been able to keep during all this. But, there's other folks out there that, like, well, if I lose my job, I lose my insurance. Why should that even be an issue? Is there, there's definitely not an easy fix for it. My phrase has always been, let's not make, healthcare for profit, and it might change a few things. But is there, I guess, what do you think the steps might be to at least get the ball rolling and distancing healthcare from employment?
There's no magic wand that can be waved over the current political landscape. I think what it comes down to is the willingness to get in the trenches and do the hard work of citizenship. And part of that hard work is not just voting in the occasional election, but actually seeking to identify and recruit people who are fit to be good candidates, who are, not everybody's suited to be a candidate for office.
Right.
It's not a role that works for everybody, but it's our job as citizens to identify those people who are a good fit for that role and who have the potential to be transformational leaders and true change agents, and then get them prepared and coached and equipped to be candidates for office, probably starting at the local level.
Yeah.
I don't think you start in campaigns for Congress. You start in campaigns for city council, county board, school board, town board. And then those people, once they figure out how to run a campaign and what it means to be an elected official, then they will naturally graduate to be the state assembly and state senate and congressional candidates of the future.
Mm-hmm.
But it's got to be people who are really devoted to revolutionizing our politics and are really willing and able to challenge what has gone so haywire in the major political parties. We've got to grow our own. That's the hard work of citizenship. If we just wait for the political establishment to serve us up the candidates of their choosing, we're going to be regularly disappointed. The citizenry has to grow its own and seek to put people in positions to challenge that power.
Mike, there's this social media movement going on, led by people who would identify with, say, a Bernie Sanders, who are saying that Democratic members, especially the so-called progressives, should tell Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, we are not going to vote to keep you in that position unless you allow a floor vote on Medicare for all. Mm-hmm. And it's created this real big split online. What's your view on that? Should the so-called progressives, people like Mark Pocan from Wisconsin, Ocasio-Cortez from New York, and Ilhan Omar from Minneapolis, should they say to Nancy Pelosi, you need to have a floor vote on Medicare for all before we will support your candidacy? What's your view on that?
I think the answer is yes. I think, look, I know how internal legislative politics works. I've seen it in the state capitol. I've watched it from more of a distance, what goes on in Capitol Hill. I know how legislative leaders will punish rank and file members by denying them committee assignments and all that kind of thing. But there comes a time when that kind of ossified, calcified leadership needs to be challenged. And we're at one of those moments where we're facing at least 4 national emergencies, some of which are global emergencies. And we have a political system that's not responding to those emergencies. It's not tackling them.
Not at all.
So that means the leadership has to be challenged, I think, in a way that is unique and is matched to the moment. And I think that those who are identified as the progressives among the Democrats in Congress, they need to play hardball. They need to use what leverage they have to seek to bring about change. And some of them will be punished for it. And that punishment will have to be accepted and dealt with. But it really, the people of this country need that current leadership to be challenged in new and creative and aggressive ways. So I'm of the view that they should be doing this thing. Now I'm not going to, if some of them decline and they stick with Pelosi, I'm not going to write them off forever. And I know some people in the progressive ranks will do that. They'll say, I never, if Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or Mark Pohan don't do that, then I'm never gonna give them any support ever again. Look, people, when faced with tough decisions in elected office, they're not always going to make the choice I would like them to make. They're not always going to act the way I would like them to act, but we should put their feet to the fire, and we should challenge them when they come up short, when they don't do what we would like to see them do, when they don't do what we need them to do. So I think this is a moment where they have to take these kinds of steps.
Oh, I agree. I mean, the Republicans had something like 60 votes to overturn Obamacare. The Democrats should have 60 votes to pass Medicare for all if they have to.
Yeah.
I mean, after all, it has the support of 80% of the public. Right? We're in the middle of a global pandemic. To me, it's a no-brainer.
But you know why the resistance remains on Capitol Hill. And some of them were even people who were defeated in this last election because of this kind of betrayal. Donna Shalala, who has strong ties to Wisconsin, former UW-Madison chancellor, who went on to serve in the Obama administration, later got elected to Congress in Florida. She's not a Medicare for All supporter. She even opposed an effort in Florida to enable the importation of prescription drugs from Canada.
Crazy.
And she said that was the stupidest idea she'd ever heard, allowing prescription drugs to be imported from Canada because they're cheaper. And when people can't afford prescription drugs, when they can't get health care, when they can't afford to go to the doctor, that's an emergency. That kind of health insecurity needs to be dealt with. She wasn't dealing with it. And you looked at the money she was getting from the pharmaceutical industry, from the healthcare conglomerates. That explained it. So that Democratic leadership has gotten so much money from interests that benefit from our current healthcare arrangement. They haven't been open to things like Medicare for All or importing cheaper prescription drugs from Canada. They're not willing to go there because they've got wealthy donors telling them not to go there. Well, that's why there has to be, I think, extreme measures taken. But and that even means taking the risk of being punished by a legislative leader, and being considered an outcast if necessary among your own colleagues in Congress. You have to decide with the people at some point and say, look, there are an awful lot of people suffering. They can't get health care. They can't afford prescription drugs. And this is trauma that people are dealing with, and it has to be addressed, and the political system hasn't addressed it.
Yeah. I mean, my view, Mike, and you and I have been around a long enough time. If you're a small d democracy activist in any realm, politics, academia, corporate life, you're going to be punished, right? So you might as well stand for something, right?
Waves.
Yeah, you might as well make waves, because just being labeled as a small d democracy activist, history is filled with the oppression of people in that category, right? But
yeah, absolutely.
But we look back on them and we say, wow, that person really, really stood for something. Imagine if all the abolitionists in the early 19th century had said, you know what, this is too hard. Let's give up. When the Southern aristocrats are ready, they'll end slavery. It doesn't work that way.
Of course.
You need principled people who are going to go to the mat for these things. And it's just so frustrating to me, Mike, to see that on some issues, like Medicare for All, like living wages, no-brainer issues that have the support of huge majorities of people. As you say, we've got one party is scary. It won't allow anything good to happen. And then the other party is scared. What are they scared of, Mike? Is it as simple as they're afraid of offending big donors? Is it that simple?
I think it is that simple. I think there are other factors at work, but that's the biggest factor. They're afraid of the money that will be brought to bear against them if they take a stand against those big money interests, and so they hedge their bets. They stand down when at the very moment when they're needed to take a stand. They stand down, and you know, you mentioned my race for governor and traveling 100,000 miles across the state and all of that, and then some of the experiences I had with the Democratic Party establishment and the kinds of barriers that are encountered. To me, none of that makes me look back at that experience and put it in a negative light. Mm-hmm. I went in with my eyes wide open. I jumped in the race knowing full well that I would experience those kinds of things, that I would encounter those kinds of barriers. I anticipated it. But for me, my presence in the race really had to do with trying to change the conversation, to try to change the dynamics of a race and move our politics, even if just in a minor way, to move our politics to a better place. And you know, I look back on that experience and I feel really good about it. The fact that I didn't win the nomination or become governor is nothing. That's not a painful thought to me, because I had looked at 3 previous elections for governor where the party basically anointed a candidate and cleared a path to the nomination for that candidate, and then they ended up losing to Scott Walker. Mm-hmm. And I thought, doggone it, we're going to have a really vibrant and robust primary, and we're going to change the nature of the debate. We had candidates who wouldn't even support more than a $10 an hour minimum wage, much
That's
less
right.
50. They were timid on all the issues. They wouldn't take strong stands. And I thought, doggone it, we're going to change that debate. And I think that's where change comes from. And I mentioned this in my most recent book. You look back, you mentioned the abolitionists, Tony, and you're absolutely right. Well, how about the suffragists?
Yep.
All of the most famous suffragists who spent their lives fighting for the right for women to vote didn't live to ever be able to cast a ballot. They fought for their entire life for something that they ended up never being able to enjoy. And yet, who could look at their efforts now with the benefit of hindsight and see their work as a failure? And that's, I guess, what I would say to those progressive members of Congress. In the end, it doesn't matter whether they have a long career in Congress or not. What matters is whether our society progresses, whether we move our politics to a point where it's wrestling with the kinds of major challenges facing our country, whether people's lives are better off. And if you end up not winning an election, but you change the conversation or you change the nature of the debate in a place like Capitol Hill for the better, that's an accomplishment. It's not a defeat. Yeah. But politicians don't tend to look at it that way.
No, They don't. Mike, what can we expect, do you think, from Joe Biden? Is it going to be, okay, maybe there'll be some good cabinet picks? I mean, do you expect anything, major transformational from the Biden administration?
I don't make any assumptions about what the Biden presidency will end up being. He could rise to the occasion and be a much more ambitious and impactful president than many people expect him to be. A lot of people see, he is a centrist, and he's seen as kind of the consummate politician, the kind of the deal-making politician, but he's coming into office at a moment of immense crisis, and maybe he can rise to the occasion. But I think if his presidency matches the moment, it will only be because he is pushed. It's only because the citizenry demands him to be a president more in the mold of a Franklin Roosevelt than he would otherwise likely be. So I don't think anybody should just say, well, Biden's never going to do anything. We should all be pushing like crazy to make sure that he does.
Right.
And maybe his impulses will be centrist. Maybe his impulses are cautious. But this is not a moment that calls for caution. This is not a moment where an abundance of caution is wise. This is a moment where bold action has to be taken for the good of the country. And he needs to be pushed to be big and to think big and act boldly. And that's what we're also trying to push Tony Evers to do here at the state level.
Oh, yeah.
Think bigger and act more boldly than you otherwise might expect him to. He too is sort of a cautious centrist, an incrementalist by nature. That's who he is. And that's who Joe Biden is. But that doesn't mean that the citizenry shouldn't push them to be more than that.
Exactly.
I got a question about Evers. You have a Democratic governor, you've got a Republican legislature, and they have essentially, stifled his power. How are they able to do that? I mean, he's the boss, right? So what needs to happen to fix that so that doesn't happen in the future?
Well, they have gone to great lengths to strip him of as many powers as they can. They haven't stripped him of all of his powers. He still has some significant ones. They have blocked him at every turn. They've tried to stymie all of his efforts. So look, we're not going to get any change that we want through separate legislation because Republicans in the legislature will never pass any bills that Tony Evers wants.
Right.
The one route that does create an opportunity for some change to occur is through the state budget. The state budget process. It's the one and only bill that has to pass every 2-year session. Mm-hmm. And the governor does still have considerable veto authority to shape and reshape the state budget. So the governor in his first budget was pretty timid in terms of how much he asked for and what he demanded. The legislature didn't give him much of anything, and we didn't get a budget that really moved Wisconsin forward. But I think for the governor to get anything, he has to plausibly threaten some Republican pet programs. He has to be able to plausibly threaten things that Republicans hold dear and propose eliminating funding for those pet programs that the Republicans really want. They'll try to restore that funding, of course, when they get their hands on the budget. But the governor needs to make it really clear that unless he gets some of his priorities, unless he gets some of the change that he desires, that he will use his veto authority to eliminate that funding again, because they do not have 2/3 majorities in both houses of the legislature. They don't have the super majorities required to override his vetoes. So his vetoes would stick. If he says, I will shut down these programs that you really value. For example, the state subsidies that go to allow people to send their kids to private schools, the voucher system. Mm-hmm. What if the governor said, we're not going to have a voucher system if my budget is approved. We're going to eliminate all funding for that program. That is a program that the Republicans love. Mm-hmm. They will go to the mat to try to preserve it. But if he makes it clear, if you put the funding back, I'm going to veto it out again. Unless if you want this, I'm fine with letting the program die. But if you want it to live, you better doggone well give us living wages, or give us, Medicaid expansion, or give us broadband expansion, or give us, mm-hmm. something that is really valuable that will move the state forward. That's the kind of hardball that would be required in the state budget process to get anything out of this Republican legislature. And the governor has so far not shown a willingness to threaten those Republican pet programs or play hardball. We're trying to encourage him to do just that. And we're trying to rally other Wisconsinites to push the governor hard to do that kind of thing. He's not shown the inclination to do it. But I don't see any other route to make gains on progressive policy in Wisconsin. The Republicans will block it.
Wow. Well, okay. So I would actually want to switch now to the transition, because it's kind of the same thing but different. I mean, you've got, the election's over. Yeah, they're going to get certified on January 6th, but there's a lot of crap that can happen between the time that we know that Trump lost till the time that Biden takes office. How do we in the future prevent, I guess now they're calling him lame duck president, because if it's not benefiting me, I really don't care about the country right now. I mean, obviously a few things are passing and whatnot, the stimulus being one of them that he's got to sign off on, but he could really foul things up in the next, 20 days or whatever. How does future administrations, because I don't think we ever saw this coming. So what needs to be done to fix that? So if a situation like this happens again, we can avoid it, or, whatever they have to do to get them out,
There's so many things about our system that are nutty, and people don't realize that even though Joe Biden won the popular vote by more than 7 million votes, his election came down to something more on the order of 40 or 50 or 60,000 votes.
Yeah, like the same with 2016, right?
Exactly. And if Trump had gotten 20-some thousand more votes in Wisconsin and had been able to eke out 20 or 30,000 more votes in states like Michigan or Pennsylvania or a few other places, he would have been elected again. And I obviously would love to see the country do away with the electoral college system and get rid of those kinds of nutty elements of the system that do leave us very vulnerable to a very an outcome that is contrary to the wishes of the people.
Yeah.
Now, once you get a president who wins enough electoral votes to be elected, and you have somebody who is willing to go to such lengths to deny that outcome and then seek to subvert the process, all you can do is hope that enough human beings who are in positions like Supreme Court justice or member of Congress will be respectful of our institutions and will do the right thing. And we came very close to that not happening this time, but the system did hold up. The system endured a really vicious assault. Yeah. And so we can be thankful for that, and we can be relieved by that. But I think it also showed how vulnerable the institutions are, because it depends on people having the spine and the wisdom to act in a way that respects democracy and respects the will of the people. And we were perilously close to not having the right people in those positions. You look at the state level. Wisconsin's voting outcome was upheld by our state Supreme Court, but on a 4-3 vote.
Shocking.
That's crazy.
I mean, if one vote shifts, then Wisconsin's outcome would have been nullified, and hundreds of thousands of votes that were legitimate, lawful votes cast by people like you and me would have been thrown out. They would have just said, no, those don't count, and would have given us a different outcome if one vote had shifted.
Yeah,
that shows how vulnerable our democracy is.
I mean, what was especially shocking about that, Mike, was the 3 judges on a Supreme Court who were willing to throw our votes away. They only had testimony from partisans on one side. Like, how could you reach that conclusion when you haven't even invited in people who would defend our clerks?
Right.
It was shocking to me.
Well, and there's so much that's nutty about that. They were challenging ballots, saying that these were fraudulent ballots because they didn't have votes for Donald Trump on them, but they did have votes for many other Republican elected officials who were on the same ballot and who did win those elections. Now, if there was this massive ballot stuffing effort done by the Democrats for Joe Biden, why wouldn't they have also put votes for their Senate candidates or their House candidates on those ballots? Why wouldn't they have, why wouldn't they have taken the steps necessary to give Biden majorities in Congress if they're going to go to those kinds of lengths? And then what's even nuttier is that we've got such a decentralized election system that conspiracy had to involve all of these people who are your neighbors. They're people, they're librarians. They're people who are living amongst us every day, who all would have had to take part in this conspiracy to rig this election. It's really nutty, and it's scary how close they all came. You mentioned that those 3 justices in the state Supreme Court who were willing to throw away our votes only heard testimony from one side.
Right.
But the testimony that they heard didn't include any actual evidence that fraud had been committed. There were just claims. The testimony was only from one side, but the testimony also was devoid of any actual evidence.
Mike,
they still voted to throw out those votes.
One of the funniest parts of it to me was one of the judges in the majority, I think it was either Dalit or Karofsky, says to Trump's attorney, "You do realize, sir, that according to what you're saying, your own vote would be illegal." And without skipping a beat, he says, "Oh yeah, my vote's illegal too." So, and of course, none of them bothered, as Judge Hagedorn, the conservative judge who votes with the liberals on these issues, thankfully, said, you can't change the rules after the game.
Right.
Right. So that if they had won, all of a sudden, all the things they're complaining about would have been just fine.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah.
So just amazing. Mike, I have one more question for you today. Senator Ron Johnson, who's a Republican from Wisconsin, I think he's been uniquely bad on the election, on the stimulus. I mean, he's
a bad egg.
he has been. He originally said he was only going to run for 2 terms, and now he's signaling that he might run for a 3rd term. That would be 2022. You obviously ran a very impactful governor race. Would you consider throwing your hat in the ring for U.S. Senate in 2022?
I don't think that I'm the right person for this kind of role going forward, and I had a lot of people who wrote up petitions and signed petitions and went to great lengths to convince me to get in that race for governor. And I told them no for a long time. The answer was more like hell no for a long time. But they eventually talked me into it. But I think going forward, I think it's time to pass the baton to a younger generation of leaders. And I'm not sure that a 60-year-old white male is the right person for this role. And so I've really grown more comfortable with each passing day with the idea that my best role will be as an insurgent voice, but also somebody who is willing to be a good teammate and work hard at helping to mentor and prepare a new generation of leaders for these roles going forward. And unless I were to hear an overwhelming outpouring from people saying, no, it really, for some reason unknown to me, it really needs to be you, Mike, that's not a role that I want to pursue. I would much rather see it be somebody younger, and I'm more than happy to do whatever I can to help position people to take on that role and to do it successfully. So that would be my preference. It's never been my ambition to hold office. It's never been part of my life plan. But I have no regrets about making that run for governor. I feel really good about the experience, but it's not necessarily one that I'm looking to repeat.
Sure. Matt, do you have a final question?
One more question. We were talking about, having some folks in office that are a little bit younger. I'm not opposed to, any age being in office, but, here we are, 2020, and our best two are 75 years old and 78 years old. Okay. Wouldn't it be nice, thank God Pete Buttigieg is getting in there something, because I think he's going to start to make some waves. But with respect to the younger folks, how do you think, or what do you think, needs to happen, maybe at one or two events to get more Gen Y and Gen Z actually involved? We had the best turnout for voting ever, but now how do we translate that into the Gen Y and Gen Z, maybe wanting to take an interest in politics, making a decision, making differences? What do you think that would take?
Well, running for office is an immensely difficult undertaking. And for somebody who's never done it before, it's daunting and it's intimidating. You don't feel like you're worthy. You don't feel like you're equipped to do it. But if you've done it before, then you can help others sort of see where the path is and see how to travel that path. And younger people who haven't done it, who haven't had a lot of experience in the political arena, do need to be coached. They do need some help along the way. They've got the energy, they've got the passion, they've got the right values. They understand how screwed over their generation is, and what needs to change in this country. But what they lack is any experience in bringing about that change through the electoral process. And so they do need mentoring. And I, for me, it's time for people my age to step aside and make way for them. But don't just send them out there and say, hey, figure it out, people.
Right.
You need to be willing to share insights and experiences and help them understand what kinds of barriers they're going to encounter and how to deal with those barriers. And I think those who are my age or older and feel like they still have some kind of a birthright to hold these offices, I think that attitude is taken to the great detriment of our country.
Yeah.
Oh, I agree completely. Mike, thank you so much. We're going to have you back, and I hope you will come back.
I still have more questions. Yeah, we have to do this again.
Yeah, we do have to do it again. I mean, we could go on for hours with you. I want to remind our listeners to check out Mike's book, his latest book, Unscrewing America, Hints and Hopes from the Heartland. You'll see a very clear and compelling case for the kind of themes we've been talking about today. A politics that responds to average, everyday people. And, Mike, I'm hopeful like you are. I really think we can do this. Right? Go ahead.
The thing that strikes me, Tony, is that America is being remade.
It is.
And you see signs of reinvention and renewal everywhere on so many different fronts. But it's being done not with the help of our politics, but rather in spite of our politics.
Yes.
It's almost like our politics is holding the country back from the kind of reinvention and renewal that is taking place and slowing it down. But I'm tremendously inspired by how our society is responding to so many of the challenges facing us. But it's all being done in spite of our politics.
Yeah.
And if we can just align our politics with the energy and the innovation of our population, and as you say, if we can create a politics that is responsive to the people, then we can really make some hay. We can really there's no reason we shouldn't be optimistic about the future of this country. But unfortunately, we've got a politics that's really holding us back.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, once again, thanks so much for being here, Mike.
Thank you so much, man. This was awesome.
It's been a pleasure. Enjoyed the conversation greatly, and look forward to doing it again.
Absolutely.
Thanks so much, man. Take care.
All right. You too.
Tony, I really enjoyed our interview today, man. This was so much fun.
I did too. And I've known Mike now for just about 20 years, and he's just been one of the most principled and one of the most articulate, small d Democratic activists I know. And so, whatever this show can do to help get that message out. And I think it gives people hope, Matt, that, if we kind of work together, we can move beyond some of this gridlock and some of this nastiness out there.
Absolutely. Going back to, talking about all the different issues that divide us, there's really not that many that actually divide us. Most issues we all agree on. So I hope that folks can take the context of what this is and understand that, we all want to be happy. We all want to have a nice job and make some money and, have a decent place to live and heat and healthcare, et cetera. But something like this, I think, really kind of starts to peel the layers away, that there really is not that much different between the two sides.
I agree. And this, of course, is our last show before Christmas.
Yep. And
so I hope you and your family, Matt, have a happy holiday season.
Hope you guys have a great one as well. And I look forward to seeing what we're going to be doing in the coming months and year for running on empty here. This has been a lot of fun this year, and I can't wait to continue it. And hopefully we'll be at video soon. I know once we can do a few more technical things, we'll get to video soon. But this was fun. Have a great holiday, and we will see you on the next one, man.
All right. Stay elevated.
Stay elevated.
Running on Empty with Matt and Tony.